From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. How are you today, David?
Just getting my taxes ready.
So it's a happy time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And we have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hey, it's going to be an interesting show. One on GMOs and one on flyers safety.
That is correct. On the program today, we're going to talk to Professor Sheldon Krimsky, author of many books on the subject of science and ethics. Regular listeners know that we have spoken a lot about GMOs on the show, most recently with Andrew Kimbrell of the Center for Food Safety. Mr. Kimbrell argues that GMOs essentially offer nothing to the consumer and are just a way for chemical companies to sell more pesticides. Professor Krimsky has written a book entitled GMOs Decoded, where he examines the controversy around this topic from both sides. I'm looking forward to finding out on which side of the debate he lands, although I think I've got a hint. The other book we're going to touch on is entitled Conflicts of Interest in Science, where Professor Krimsky compiles 21 peer-reviewed academic articles that examine the complex relationship between the individual scientists conducting research and the groups who fund them. I know personally in my other life as a professional writer and storyteller that it's important to know who is telling you the story. That makes all the difference. That's the first part of the show. In the second part of the show, we're going to welcome back old friend Paul Hudson, director of Flyers Rights. He's going to update us on the latest news coming out of the Boeing Max 8 controversy. According to Flyers Rights, Boeing executives reportedly pressured engineers and stifled technical dissent in order to get this plane airborne quickly to compete with Airbus. And a New York Times article this week described how Boeing was trying to save money by attaching all sorts of bells and whistles on the old 737 model, which is about 50 years old, instead of investing in a new model with more integrated technology. And between these two important stories, we will also check in with Russell Mokhiber, who is always keeping tabs on the dark world of corporate malfeasance with his corporate crime report. And if we have time, we'll try to get at some listener questions. But first, let's go to the intersection of science and ethics with our first guest. David?
Professor Krimsky is the author of 16 books, including GMOs Decoded and Conflicts of Interest in Science. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Sheldon Krimsky.
Thank you. Pleased
Welcome
to be
indeed, Shelley. Listeners should know that I've known Shelley for years and read a lot of his materials. This book, which is just out, GMOs Decoded, the subtitle is A Skeptic's View of Genetically Modified Foods. It's very, very rigorous, and it was published by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Press, the MIT Press. One of the comments on the back of the book is by Nassim Taleb, who's the author of the world bestseller Black Swan and is a probability specialist in risk. And he says, quote, Sheldon Krimsky is a hero. He's one of the few scholars with classical courage. He and this book are making the world a safer place, end quote. And I mention that because this is a taboo subject for many of the mass media outlets in this country. The critics of GMO, the people who want to say who the burden of proof should be on, get shut out of places like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. It reminds me of when the subject of auto safety design and construction was taboo before 1965 and shut out, or when the issue of pesticides before Rachel Carson was shut out of the mass media, or when the subject of the risks of nuclear power was shut out from any kind of discussion. So we're not going to engage in any shutout today. And I want our listeners to listen carefully at the sequence of the questions so that you can be more informed. And the first question is the obvious one. The minute you raise any questions about GMO food, Monsanto and their coterie of well-paid scientists say there's really no significant difference for you, consumer, between the old plant inbreeding of the old days that farmers engaged in and the genetically engineered food product. Can you answer that, Professor Krimsky?
Yes, that was one of the first questions that was raised in the book. There are 7 primary questions. And the first one was, what's the difference between traditional breeding and what I call molecular breeding? That is breeding that takes place on the laboratory bench, so to speak. And after reviewing it in great depth, I realized that there was a difference because in traditional breeding, you can only go so far in terms of mixing the genes from different species and from different higher life forms. And there's a chart in the book which has, about 8 or 9 levels of life. And between species and the next level, genus, that's about all you can go in terms of traditional breeding, of mixing the genetic information. So in molecular breeding, you can go way up in kingdoms, domains, in phylums, and you can take the genes from an Arctic fish and transfer it to a lettuce plant. So there really is a difference because the capabilities of molecular breeding are far, far advanced in terms of the manipulation of life than traditional breeding.
Second question, the claim by the GMO promoters is it's absolutely necessary to alleviate world hunger. What's your answer to that?
I looked at the literature on GMOs and world hunger. I looked at it very deeply. And what I found out was that the productivity of GMOs depends so much on the land area and the way the crops are grown and so many other factors, and not so much on the GMO itself. The only thing you can say about the GMOs is that perhaps in certain areas the productivity is higher because they use more herbicides, or that it has its own internal insecticide, so there might be some gain in productivity. But then you look at another region and you find out that when the pests become resistant, there is no gain in productivity. So even in the most definitive report that has come out on GMOs by the National Academy of Sciences, they say there is no overall productivity benefit across the board for GMOs.
I was speaking recently, Professor Krimsky, with Lester Brown, who started World Watch. There are few people know more about agriculture globally than he does, and I put it to him. And he said there's no evidence at all that GMO crops are alleviating world hunger. And by the way, the more traditional response to that question is modern agronomy keeps increasing productivity per acre without GMO. And second, about of all food produced is wasted by fungus or eaten by rodents or ruined in warehouses. And that's an area of potential in order to preserve food for people in these various countries. Let me just turn to this one. This is one that's always amazed me. You have farmers who don't want to use GMO. Their farms are next to farms that want to use GMO, like GMO corn, GMO soybean. About 90% of all GMO corn and soybeans that people eat or animals eat is GMO now.
In the United States.
Yes, you're right, in the United States. So we'll get to Europe, whose governments are much more skeptical. And the issue is that these GMO seeds, and they pollinate and migrate onto the land of the farmers who don't want it. And then Monsanto's been known to sue the farmers for intellectual property seizure. Can you answer the intellectual property question and also the question of how do farmers protect themselves from the wind wafting these seeds and compromising their natural seeds?
Well, in the United States, there are no laws of sequestration. There are such laws in Europe where they require any GMO farms to be a certain distance away from other farms that don't use GMOs. So in the United States, people who grow organic food, they have to worry that they won't get accredited because some of their farms could be contaminated by GMO seeds. It's a real problem in the United States and in Canada.
And Monsanto has sued the innocent adjacent farm owners?
Well, they did in Canada, and the particular person in Canada lost the suit in the higher courts, although he didn't have to pay much of a fine, but he did lose the suit, and I can't understand the logic behind that unless they just didn't believe that the pollen came through the wind and that they thought he consciously planted the GMO seeds on his crops, on his land.
And there's no evidence of that. And that farmer has gone all over North America speaking about his concerns and how he was treated.
Miser, yeah. So, and this is happening in other places. The only confidence that consumers can have today that they are not eating GMOs is to buy organic. But that is based upon the notion that these organic farms will continue to be accredited, and they're far enough away from any GMO agriculture that will allow them to maintain their accreditation.
Yes, and avoid contamination.
That's correct.
Let's talk about Monsanto. By the way, Bayer, the big German chemical company, has bought Monsanto. And since it's bought Monsanto, which is involved in all kinds of litigation, all kinds of problems, which we'll talk about one or two of them now, Bayer stock has dropped 60%. 60%. So what about this issue of super weeds backlash to the herbicide that Monsanto sells? Can you explain to our listeners all about that?
Sure. It's like antibiotics. If you take too many antibiotics, then eventually you're going to get some bugs in your gut that will be resistant to the antibiotics and it'll be useless to you. And the same is true with herbicides and pesticides. So we predicted 20 years ago that there was, in a book that I did, that there was going to be herbicide resistance given the mass use of herbicides, particularly the glyphosate. So it's not a surprise. So now what is Monsanto doing when they get herbicide resistance? Well, they do something called stacking. Instead of one herbicide-resistant gene in the plant, they put several in it. So they might put herbicide tolerance to glyphosate and then 2,4-D. Now, 2,4-D was cited in Rachel Carson's book as a troublesome chemical back in 1962, and it's still troubling and it still has health effects. So what they're doing is to try to use more herbicide tolerance in the crop to react to the fact that there's herbicide resistance in the weeds. In other words, they keep adding more and more herbicide-resistant genes in the plants, complicating the whole structure of the plant.
It's like a vicious circle for them. They have to engage, in more forceful attacks on these weeds in order to head off mutations that make the weeds more resistant. I don't think I ever told you, Shelley, but over a decade ago, we had a meeting with the CEO of Monsanto. He used to be a public interest type lawyer in his younger days in Washington. And so he came to Washington. We had about 15 people around the big table. And I remember two things came out of that. When we challenged him about the right to know, that people should be able to go to the grocery store and easily find out whether the products are GMO or non-GMO, he said, I have no objection to that. I just want to make sure it's done right. Well, Monsanto has never dropped its opposition against state initiatives like in California and other places and Washington against the kind of disclosure that you and others think are needed. And the second thing, you'll be amused by this. There was a farmer there that Monsanto brought, and he had several thousand acres of, I think, soy and corn from Iowa and Nebraska. And he participated in the discussion. And I asked him, I said, why are you using GMO seeds when there's really no evidence of greater productivity per acre? And he gave me a one-line answer. He says, because it gives me more time to spend with my wife. In other words, convenience. You don't have to spend time knocking out the weeds. And this convenience thing, which may be on the epitaph of modern civilization, because people are paying huge prices for convenience, like processed food, etc. How do you react to that farmer saying that?
Well, I mean, the whole question is, what's the balance between convenience and all the other effects? Glyphosate, when it was first introduced, was passed through the EPA rather easily without much rigorous evaluation. Now, in the past few years, since there have been lawsuits and people have raised questions about it, and since the International Agency for Research on Cancer claimed it was a probable human carcinogen, well, now there's a lot of research going on with glyphosate. And my own experience with pesticides and with other chemicals is it usually takes 25 to 50 years to ban a chemical that is known to be dangerous. Just think of PCBs, just think of lead, just think of asbestos. These things were known to be dangerous 50 years before they were eliminated. And then when we take them to court and show them the evidence, industry will fight it tooth and nail and drag it on and say, we need more and more evidence to prove that it's dangerous. So my view is, before we let something on the market, we should take the 25 years to prove it's safe.
That's the burden of proof. You can really get a long way, listeners, when they try to hoist these chemicals and other toxics on you. Just say, look, company, it's the burden of proof is on you. It's not on the people. It's not on the regulatory agency. It's on you to prove that it's safe before you push it into the marketplace. I think some listeners are probably wondering, what's the status of BT milk now? You know, can people buy milk without Monsanto's ingredient?
Yeah, they certainly can. And this milk was really designed, we fed cows certain chemicals to speed up the production of milk. So, and maybe increase their production of milk, but it also caused a lot of mastitis in the cows. I mean, if you start giving cows chemicals, there's going to be some side effects, of course. But now a lot of milk producers are putting down that they don't have any genetically modified milk. So you can get it. The labeling was not banned. As long as you don't say anything like the genetically modified form of milk is different or is dangerous, you can still label it.
Yeah, because Monsanto sued several farmers mercilessly with a New York lawyer who specialized in it, tried to intimidate them, and simply telling the customers that this milk is not BT milk, because they claim, well, that implies that somehow it's different from regular milk and it's deceptive. The corporate lawyers have got a lot to answer for in the coming years in our country.
I think you had somebody on the show that said that the products that they're producing really don't have much to offer the consumer. And I'll give you the latest example of that. The latest example is the genetically engineered salmon. The only value of that salmon is that it grows faster and bigger than the regular salmon that is in the oceans or that is in the salmon farms. It doesn't offer any nutritional value to the consumer at all. And the one product that would offer some nutritional value is so-called golden rice, that is rice with biofortified vitamin in it. And that's still not on the market after 16 years. So all of the products that are out right now in the U.S. are really designed for productivity, so-called productivity, and have nothing to do with whether it's nutritionally beneficial. The other thing that your listeners have to understand is that in the United States, there's no mandatory requirement of testing of any genetically engineered crops. There is a requirement to test the GE salmon, and it was tested pretty rigorously, as a matter of fact. I've gone through a lot of the testing requirements, and it took about 15 years before it was approved. But in terms of the food products, they're approved by virtue of the manufacturer. And the argument is, if the manufacturer finds something wrong, they wouldn't put it on the market. So that's very different than Europe, which requires testing of every product.
Let's talk about Europe. Europe is much more skeptical, and it's very hard to sell GMO products in Europe. There are some exceptions, but why don't you tell our listeners how European governments and European scientists look on GMO crops?
Well, first of all, they require labeling of any GMO food or food product. That's number one. Number two, the European Union passed regulations that require that every product that is put out on the market has to be evaluated for toxicity and for compositional analysis. The latest report that I mentioned of the National Academies, the 600-page report, did say that the only real way of understanding whether you're going to get differences in the GMO product versus the non-GMO parental strain from which it was obtained is to do a complete analysis of all the molecules and metabolites that are in the product. They don't even believe that the animal studies feeding the animals the product is going to be sufficient or satisfactory. And yet, no regulation requires that. So here's the National Academy saying there's only one way to really know whether or not these products are different in nutrition. And it is true. No one is keeling over when eating GE corn or GE soybeans. No one. We'd probably know that. But no one was keeling over when they introduced fast food into the United States. It took 30 or 40 years before the rise in diabetes and obesity. So sometimes the nutritional value of food can be a much more subtle impact than simply, oh, it's going to kill people.
That's the difference, listeners, between acute harm and chronic harm. He's saying that no one keels over when they eat GMO food. There's no acute harm, but chronic harm over the years, that's where they need to be more testing. That's why the GMO industry doesn't like government support of testing over the years. Professor Krimsky edited a book called The GMO Deception in 2014. And I wrote a lengthy introduction to that book, and it was almost completely blacked out. And you don't see Professor Krimsky in the op-ed pages of the New York Times. When he writes a letter to the Wall Street Journal to counteract Mr. Miller, who gets in the Wall Street Journal all the time out of the Hoover Institution at Stanford, a corporate-dominated and funded so-called think tank, the letters don't get printed. So let's talk very candidly about why is NPR and PBS and the big paper, what are they afraid of here? Corporate science is dominating academic science. And corporate science is not peer-reviewed. It is secret. It is attached to political power of Monsanto in Washington. It is profit-driven. And academic science is peer-reviewed. It's not supposed to be profit-driven. It's supposed to be available for the public interest. And it's on the defensive, and we're going to be talking just in a very short minutes on the book Conflicts of Interest in Science to show how corporate science is dominating in universities and elsewhere, increasingly academic science. But let's get back to the media. Why is there a media blackout here?
Well, I think, as in any controversy, if the National Academy puts out a position that says, don't you worry, GM food is just as safe as traditional crops, if some leading scientists who are in the field of molecular genetics or food make the claims, the media look to these people as the gatekeepers. And unless somebody comes up with a concrete study which shows a severe hazard, I don't think the media is going to change its position. The media is not subtle. It wants to see a dramatic effect. Unfortunately, some of the elite groups have been bought off by industry, so they're not going to say too much about what could happen. And until the media sees a dramatic effect, they're not going to respond because the elites in society are not responding. The National Academy is not responding, etc. So I'm not sure I can see a way out of it, unless you get the media that's more open to understanding the nuances of all of these events?
Well, this book, The GMOs Decoded, A Skeptic's View of Genetically Modified Foods by Sheldon Krimsky, is going to help break that taboo. And in case your listeners want to know what foods have already been approved, on page 153 of his book, he has this phrase: other approved genetically engineered crops include sugar beets, alfalfa, canola, papaya, summer squash, potato, and apples. And this suggests that the U.S. approval process is far from uncertain, notwithstanding the more cautious approval in Europe, even while many scientific questions are still unanswered. GMOs remain one of the most persistent and resilient technological controversies in modern history, end quote. That's in the book GMOs Decoded, published by MIT Press in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now we're going to the conflicts of interest in science. I'm sure listeners have read articles about medical doctors and medical school engaging in research. They don't disclose they have stock in companies. They don't disclose when they write in medical journals that they're consultants to these companies. It's rampant. And what struck me in the book, Professor Krimsky, is, listen to this, on page 71, quote, at Harvard, the biotechnology faculty has ties to 43 different commercial firms, at Stanford 25, and at MIT 27. For MIT, at least 31% of the faculty in its Department of Biology had commercial affiliations, while for Stanford and Harvard, the figure for biotech faculty across several departments was 19%, end quote. And then you say, in that quote, in 1974, Monsanto and Harvard University signed a contract after a year and a half of negotiation. Under the agreement, Monsanto gave Harvard $23 million in research support, laboratory space, construction, and endowment money. In return, Harvard gave Monsanto the patent rights to a substance called tumor angiogenesis factor, TAF, which was involved in the growth of cancerous tumors. End quote. And then the book is full of these documented situations where corporate-funded academic research can threaten public health. That's the subtitle of your book, How Corporate-Funded Academic Research Can Threaten Public Health. Tell our listeners how.
Well, I began looking at this about 35 years ago. And in the mid-'80s, you couldn't even raise the question of conflicts of interest in science and medicine. Nobody would even listen to you. And finally, in 1985, the New England Journal of Medicine said, you know something? We're going to ask our contributors to disclose their interests with the pharmaceutical industry. And they were the first ones. And then the Journal of the American Medical Association came through. And that's when I started investigating this in great depth. And, you know, it occurred to me that you can't have a reliable democratic system if you don't have a free and open and honest scientific community. Because how else will people know what the truth is or what the best effort at the truth is at any one time? So I began looking at all the kinds of conflicts that existed, and we exposed a bunch of them, and we began to put pressure on certain organizations, at least to have disclosure. At least if you have disclosure, you can decide whether you believe the stuff or not based upon who funded it. And we also found a phenomenon called the funding effect. We found, and other people have validated this, that when private corporations fund academic research, the general effect is that the results of the research are in conformity with the financial interests of the funder, compared to similar research on similar items by nonprofit organizations or government. That's a serious problem because that suggests that corporate funding of research results in bias in the outcome. And we just have to look at current newspapers. The Washington Post did an in-depth study of Coca-Cola and how the soda industry tries to influence health officials, tries to influence the science. You know, there's other articles that talk about 3M and how a lawsuit paid experts to support the safety of some of 3M's chemicals. The most valuable information we have gotten about what corporations try to do to influence science is because of lawsuits. And here I have to give you some commendations for emphasizing torts and how important they are in democracy. Without these tort cases, we wouldn't have learned what the devious methods of the tobacco industry were to prevent people from understanding the effects of tobacco. And because
by the
of
way,
the lawsuit,
the Coca-Cola funded research, not surprisingly, came out saying exercise to reduce weight, and they minimize the role of sugar. Isn't that right?
that's exactly right. It's fat and lack of exercise. And they supported exercise programs in schools, but they never addressed the question of sugar. And the eminent nutritionist Marion Nestle just came out with a book on this issue. And she talks about how the sugar industry tried to influence science. So I think that disclosure is very important, but it's not the only thing. We have federal advisory committees, and there is a rule in the legislation that says that no one with a substantial conflict of interest should be allowed to serve on a federal advisory committee. That's rule number one. Rule number two is that this rule number one can be waived, and it often is. So we have to get the government to prevent conflicts of interest on its federal advisory committees. And we did a study of professional societies who issue clinical practice guidelines, for example. These are very important because clinicians don't have the time to do research, so they read these guidelines. But if these guidelines are influenced by corporations, then how can we trust them? So we've made recommendations that you not allow conflicts of interest on committees that produce clinical practice guidelines. When we investigated Monsanto with its litigation documents, we looked at 10,000 pages of litigation documents. We found out that they admitted to ghostwriting articles for scientific journals, and we published the results. So we have to be very vigilant about what gets published and what kind of ghostwriting there still exists, even though it's unethical and most journals would be against it. It's still happening.
Well, we've been talking with Professor Sheldon Krimsky, who's taught for years at Tufts University. His work is massively documented, massively footnoted. He often has to be the voice of superb scientists who are not able to speak out and are vulnerable to intimidation. And here we go again, Shelley. Have you been on NPR, PBS? Have these books been reviewed by the New York Times or Washington Post?
No, not yet. Not yet, no.
Well, listeners should call their newspaper or magazine or the Washington Post, New York Times, say, why not? You've published books on who've taken the other commercial side. Heading off one question is there any requirement at the state and federal level about to be passed requiring labeling of GMO products?
Well, yes, there was a law passed, and it was supported by Monsanto, and it was really used to stop state legislation on labeling, which would have been very open and clear. And the federal law, which has not yet been implemented, is going to be very difficult. It might require that you have a cell phone, or it might require that you call a number, rather than just having an explicit label that says, this is a GMO product. That was passed, I think it was passed just at the end of the Obama administration, and it was heavily lobbied by the food industry and Monsanto because they didn't want to have states take on the role of labeling.
As California and Vermont were trying to do.
Yeah, Massachusetts, they all passed some labeling laws. And Vermont, it was ready to go right on until it was derailed by the federal legislation. So right now, we don't know what's GMO on the marketplace. But it's very interesting how a number of corporations are trying to brand themselves as having no GMOs.
I see that a lot in stores. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of
Yeah.
time, unfortunately. The books are Conflicts of Interest in Science, How Corporate-Funded Academic Research Can Threaten Public Health by Sheldon Krimsky, and GMOs Decoded, A Skeptic's View of Genetically Modified Foods by Sheldon Krimsky, published by MIT Press. There you have it, listeners. Go to work on these information sources and make our food safer and our environment safer and our science more solidly based. Thank you very much,
So
Professor
long, Ralph.
Krimsky.
Thanks for the opportunity and for the support. And I'll pass around the website and send it to 100 people, and hopefully they'll start listening to you.
Very good. Thank you.
We have been speaking with Professor Sheldon Krimsky. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we're going to talk to old friend Paul Hudson of Flyers Rights, who is going to update us on the Boeing Max 8 situation, an airplane that has claimed over 350 lives in the past few months. But before we talk to Paul, we're going to send you over to the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., where our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, has filed his latest report on the scourge of white-collar crime.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 12, 2019. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Securities and Exchange Commission awarded $50 million to two whistleblowers whose high-quality information assisted the agency in bringing a successful enforcement action. One whistleblower received an award of $37 million, and the other received an award of $13 million. Whistleblowers, like those being awarded, may be the source of smoking gun evidence and indispensable assistance that strengthens the SEC's ability to protect investors and the capital markets, said Jane Norberg, chief of the SEC's whistleblower office. These awards show how critically important whistleblowers can be to the SEC's investigation and ability to bring a case to successful and efficient resolution. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Now to fill us in on the latest on the Boeing Max 8 controversy is our next guest. David?
Paul Hudson has been a groundbreaking public interest advocate for over 30 years. In the 1970s, in energy and utility policy. In the 1980s, for crime victim rights. In the 1990s to 2012, for air travelers and terrorist victims. He led the Pan Am 103 Lockerbie bombing victim family organization and the Aviation Consumer Action Project. Today, he is the president of Flyers Rights, which is keeping on top of the Boeing Max 8 story. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Paul Hudson.
Glad to be here.
Welcome indeed, Paul. I think most people know that these 737 MAX planes have been grounded by governments all over the world. The U.S. government was the last one. And there are about 370 of them. There are orders for about 5,000 of them from airlines domestic and around the world. Boeing keeps having to postpone its so-called software upgrade. And remarkably, a few days ago, the head of Boeing, Mr. Mullenberg, came as close. Any CEO has come admitting that their software caused the crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia. So let me ask you this. What do you think the prospects are for this plane to be prohibited by our government from ever flying again? Every day, more and more incriminating evidence comes, and the New York Times had a devastating article recently. Among others, it quotes Richard Ludke, a former Boeing engineer who helped design the Max's cockpit. He said, quote, "It was stated at the time, but that was 50 years ago. It's not a good airplane for the current environment," end quote. And we're seeing these kinds of authoritative comments in media from the Seattle Times to the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. So if listeners want to ask, you had Flyers Rights, and people should go to flyersrights.org and join it. We'll have more on that later. If they ask you, Paul Hudson, is this plane ever going to fly again? What would your response be?
Well, that's a $64 question, Ralph, but it's not looking good for the 737 MAX. And in fact, there's so many moving parts here. We have a slew of government investigations, we have civil lawsuits, and we have Boeing struggling to be able to get their plane off the ground again with some kind of fix. We don't know how it's going to all turn out, but we have seen extension after extension asked for by Boeing. And now, whereas they thought they were going to have the result at the end of April. Now they're looking at May or later. So personally, I don't know all the whole story, but I would take a guess that we will not see this plane back in the air anytime soon.
Well, let's ask a more specific question. If someone says, well, we've been reading about all these Boeing software fixes, patches, they just had another glitch, they keep postponing. These software systems are not needed on the Boeing 737-700 or the Boeing 737-800. What does that tell you about the design defect of the larger engine-equipped 737 MAX, which altered the center of gravity and the aerodynamic design of the plane and made it prone to stall rather than stall-proof? Can you comment on that?
Well, I'm not an aviation expert, but the experts that we do rely on, they all pretty much say the same thing, that the plane should have been redesigned from scratch, and it wasn't. Whether this is a fatal defect or not, we don't know. But we also have now exposed in a major way the dysfunction of the FAA's certification process. So the rest of the world is, and flyers and airlines perhaps, are not going to be confident, even if Boeing says it's okay, even if the FAA says it's okay. So what we're suggesting is that people who are uncomfortable with this, that they make sure that their reservations are not going to be on the 737 MAX. The two airlines in the U.S., American and Southwest, that have these planes, or the most of them anyway, a little bit they have with United, they have canceled all their flights into the first week of June that would involve the MAX airplane. But people, if they have reservations going further than that, they may want to change to an alternate flight.
You've been on the FAA Advisory Committee for a long time. There's a 1980 House of Representatives Transportation Committee report that criticized severely how close the FAA was to Boeing and other aircraft manufacturers like McDonnell Douglas, and that was 1980. In 2011, the CEO of Boeing, the predecessor to Mr. Muhlenberg, wanted to start a clean sheet aircraft to replace the 737, but then when American Airlines announced that it's going to buy the Airbus 320neo, Boeing freaked out and said to its engineers, quick, we got to get this 737 MAX to market. And that's when they forced the Boeing engineers to compromise their engineering integrity under pressure from the executives. What I think most people don't know is that Boeing has underinvested in its new plane projects, especially the 737. And between 2009 and 2017, Boeing bought back $30 billion of their stock, which doesn't produce one job and should have been used to invest in new and safer narrow-body passenger planes. That's $30 billion that basically is used to improve the metrics of the compensation packages of these top Boeing executives. To make matters worse, 4 weeks before the Indonesia crash, Congress passed, as you know, an authorization bill for the FAA where they pushed the FAA to give more delegation power to Boeing to inspect and certify its own planes. And then in December, the board of directors of Boeing announced another $20 billion stock buyback. So they are never going to be able to convince the American people that they don't have the money to provide for the creation of a safer, narrow passenger jet and to replace the 737 MAX. You know, we lost our wonderful grandniece, as you lost your daughter 30 years ago in the Pan Am explosion over Scotland. And we're never going to stop trying to make airline travel safer, as you have done over the years. But I want you just to give our listeners a little sense of this coziness between the FAA and Boeing that starts with Congress and the White House over the years cutting budgets and keeping the FAA having adequate staff and pushing the FAA to become a delegator to Boeing instead of a regulator.
Yeah, that's really, I think, on a policy basis, the heart of the issue. This is not even the first time that this has backfired. In 2013, there was a grounding for 6 weeks of the 787 Dreamliner. That was a newly designed plane because of battery fires. We got involved in it and filed petitions with the NTSB for the grounding because the major battery experts in the United States were publicly freaking out and saying these batteries never should have been allowed in these planes. Had the FAA not delegated everything to Boeing to certify the safety of that airplane, if they had vetted those batteries, which was a major part of their electrical system, with outside experts, they never would have gotten off the drawing board. But instead, by delegating the regulatory authority, not just the design and the testing, to Boeing, they have really shot themselves in the foot, hopefully maybe in the heart. Now with the 737 Max, they have gone several steps further. Not only does the Boeing company design it, and in many cases they subcontract the designs to others, like apparently they did for this MCAS system, but they then do their own testing with the employees that they select, and then they have another set of employees, including the chief certifier, that certifies the whole thing as a delegate of the FAA. And the FAA is simply a bystander at this point. You're right, they've been hollowed out in many ways with not enough money and staff, but also the FAA does have quite a bit of money, and they could easily have many of these things tested and vetted by outside experts, but they don't do that.
You know, Congress has opened up hearings in the Senate and in the House, and the National Transportation Safety Board is conducting an investigation. The Inspector General of the Department of Transportation is really doing a good job. He accused the FAA of having too cozy a relationship. And there is a Justice Department FBI criminal probe that's opened up with a grand jury in Virginia. All these investigations are susceptible to being pulled back by political restraints, but the civil lawsuits under the tort system are not. And so there's going to be a parallel track here to get at the truth and bring Boeing to justice. Are you going to be testifying at any of the hearings in Congress, Paul? And my concern with Congress is they take a lot of freebies from these airlines, you know, free upgrades to first class, waiving reservation fee charges. We sent a survey twice to every member of Congress asking them to check off which freebie they have been taking. And not one member, not even our friends, answered. Senator Blumenthal said he doesn't do that, and I hope he'll answer the survey. But Boeing gives money to 330 members of Congress, campaign contributions. Do you think Congress is going to punt again? Or do you think these two crashes and the horrific disclosures by the media, which is doing a good job, will get them to their senses and even do what you've been urging, pass a really comprehensive passenger Bill of Rights? What's your prediction here? Are you going to testify?
Well, we've offered that, but so far we haven't been asked to testify. The first round of hearings just involved calling in the FAA. The next round is going to involve, I believe, calling in Boeing. We believe there should be another panel with passenger reps, outside experts also, but I haven't heard back from those committees and subcommittees yet. There's also another thing. Even if you leave aside the compromise position that Congress is in, to do a very detailed, comprehensive investigation is not something that is really that the congressional committees are up for. They need a commission, a national commission, like they had after 9/11, like they had after Pan Am 103, to really get to the bottom of it. You can certainly have members of Congress on the commission, as they were on the Pan Am 103 Lockerbie Commission, but it has to be separate and apart. This will take months, and Congress has many things on their plate, and they won't focus on something like this for more than a month or two.
Well, that's very unfortunate. Of course, we're all going to try to make sure that doesn't happen and that they finally do their job. You know, after the hijacks to Cuba, as you know, in the late 60s and early 70s, people would have urged the FAA to require the airlines to invest $3,000 per plane and toughen the cockpit doors and the locks. And that would have prevented 9/11. It wouldn't have prevented the hijack, but they couldn't have taken control of the plane. And look what 9/11 led to in terms of the Afghanistan-Iraq wars, tragedies and calamities that could have all been prevented if the FAA did its job. So let's end on this note before I ask Steve and David what questions they have. You've been working on this a long time, Paul, and it's really amazing how difficult it is to get airline passengers to band together, to join a wonderful consumer group like Flyers' Rights. It's been said it's like herding cats. I think it's more difficult than herding cats, because I could never understand why the business travelers who number in the millions, who fly planes for their business to get from A to B, they haven't organized a powerful consumer group to put the wood to Congress and the FAA. Can you just give a brief for Flyers' Rights and why people should join it and what kind of information they get?
Well, Flyers' Rights has now been around for over 10 years. We are by far the largest and the only really mass-based consumer group that is solely focused on aviation issues. We have roughly 60,000 members. These are people that have donated, and these are people that have volunteered. These are people who sign our petitions. You have to start by going to flyersrights.org, and then you have to follow the prompts to join the organization. We have reached out to other consumer groups and to business traveler groups, and we're hoping that they will also step up to the plate. But you're right, without a strong organization, Boeing alone has something like 100 lobbyists now running around Capitol Hill. And, we have less than 1/1,000th or 1/10,000th of the budget that the airline lobby has. So without serious, not only individuals, but serious contributions, is going to make it very hard for us to prevail.
I have a question, and I wonder if, Paul, you would agree with this, because I heard Ralph say something that I very rarely hear him say. And on this issue, he said, the media is doing a good job, unquote. First of all, Ralph, did you really mean that? And Paul, would you agree with that?
Oh, I do mean that. Since the Ethiopian crash, they've done a really excellent job. They sort of were lulled into complacency after the previous Indonesian crash in late October. But I think the Seattle Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal are really doing a good job.
And it seems like we were speaking with Sheldon Krimsky earlier and asking him about the media coverage of the GMO issue, and he pointed out, unless it's something dramatic, the media doesn't cover it. And I guess an airline crash is dramatic enough for them to cover it, which may account for the media doing a good job.
What do you think, Paul?
Yes, I would agree. After Pan Am 103 went down in December of '88, I organized a press conference in New York City to allow family members to, essentially speak their mind. And we reserved a small conference room at the Grand Hyatt next to Grand Central Station. And we expected there would be a few reporters there. Well, there were at least 30, and they were from all over the world. And there were so many cameras that we had to actually expand to a larger space. What this story gives the media, besides the sensationalism that comes from a mass disaster and all these deaths, it also has an international impact. There were 35 countries represented on this plane in Ethiopia. And there were, many countries represented, victims from all over the world on the Pan Am 103 Lockerbie crash. So that is another thing. The fact that Boeing is involved would appear to be more than negligence, gross negligence, or even somehow criminal conduct. That adds another dimension to it. And then finally, you have the scandalous way that the FAA has been regulating, and that has another totally different but related component. So when you put all these things together, it makes the story a much bigger deal than a typical air crash.
Let's hope the media stays with it and doesn't peter out and get distracted.
And you have whistleblowers coming out of the woodwork on this?
We are getting calls from engineers that work for Boeing, and I can't say more than that right now.
Okay.
But we hope that that will help expose what needs to be revealed.
And the call for whistleblowers, Steve, has come not only from Paul and other consumer advocates, it's actually coming from the House Transportation Committee. They put out a call for whistleblowers, and I think other groups are putting out a call. They don't have to be just from Boeing. They could be from suppliers. It could be ex-aerospace engineers, retired experts. They're already being quoted in many newspapers authoritatively. So all this is going to come out. Boeing better know that and not fight it in its own commercial interest. It's flyersrights.org. Go to it and join and get the sense that you're going to band together if you're going to fly safely in the future. The voice of the passenger has to be heard in an organized daily fashion. We're asking all members of Congress who have taken Boeing contributions to return the contributions to Boeing, or even better, to send the contributions that they shouldn't have taken to flyersrights.org. You know, they returned the contributions from Harvey Weinstein. Boeing caused the death of 346 people in Indonesia and Ethiopia. That's the least these members of Congress can do in terms of paying their due respects. Thank you very much, Paul Hudson, Director of flyersrights.org. Your airline passenger fighter. Become part of it.
Thank you, Ralph.
We have been speaking with Paul Hudson of Flyers Rights. We will link to Flyers Rights at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again today, Professor Sheldon Krimsky and Paul Hudson of Flyers Rights. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap-up. We've got some great more stuff with Paul Hudson. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after this episode is posted.
For Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everyone. And it's because people like you over the past 10 years made Flyers Rights a functioning group. That means you can make it an even more powerful group on your members of Congress and the FAA. You all fly, don't you? Go to flyersrights.org.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up, where we speak a little more with both of our guests. First, Steve asked a question of Sheldon Krimsky.
Before we close, I'm sure that Steve and David might have a couple quick comments or questions.
Yeah. I guess a comment, and it's what I run up against when I talk to people about not only GMOs, but about nuclear power. And these are well-meaning people who believe in science. And they believe in science so much, it seems like they feel that science is going to save us. And they are reacting to sort of the anti-intellectual, anti-science bias of, what comes from the right wing normally. So I find myself in interesting debates and conversations over these issues being sort of portrayed as anti-science. Is this a phenomenon you've encountered, Professor Krimsky?
No, I've never been attacked for being anti-science. My early training was in physics, and I am totally pro-science, but I'm also in favor of honest science. And when I see people taking money from corporations, and when I see the outcome of their work being influenced by that money, that is not honest science. And, I'm also a great believer in skepticism. Robert Merton, the great sociologist of science at Columbia, identified organized skepticism as one of the foundation stones of science. And asking questions until you get the answers is a very important virtue. And that's what I do. And nobody can say that's anti-science. And I don't think I've been attacked for being anti-science. I have been attacked in a couple of cases for having a conflict of interest, believe it or not, because I wrote books. And somebody said that that's a conflict of interest to write a book.
Because you're trying to sell your book, meaning.
Well,
all he's doing is
trying
to sell books, right? That's the
that's all I'm
canard.
doing, right.
The great British scientist and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead once said, a cardinal precept of the scientific method is, quote, to keep options open for revision, end quote. To the extent that Monsanto and corporate science try to shut out inquiries like yours, skepticism like yours, they're the ones who are against the scientific method. How would people reach you?
Oh, well, I answer questions from everyone all over the world. They just Google my name, Sheldon Krimsky, and they'll get to my website and email me. I have one email that I answer every day. So I'm happy to talk to people or provide whatever help and advice I can.
And now David kicks off more of a discussion with Paul Hudson.
You have any questions for the wrap-up, David, Steve?
Well, I wanted to ask about national airlines. We've, since Jimmy Carter, been deregulating the airlines. How many European countries have national airlines, and do they compete with private airlines?
They're pretty much faded out of the picture. All the big airlines that were, flag carriers for their country have privatized in one way or another. Some countries still own a big piece of them, but they were not able to really compete with the private sector corporations that had better access to capital, were not involved with politics and so forth. So there are very few of those left. That's really not much of a factor today.
Okay. I'm just wondering, next time we have to bail out an airline, whether or not we should keep it.
Well, the airlines have been in a boom and bust cycle for many years, especially since deregulation in '78. But by the way, deregulation was not supposed to deregulate safety. That was the big exception. It was to deregulate the economics, mainly fares and scheduling, which formerly had been controlled by the government. So there's a lot of problems that the deregulation caused, and there have been waves after wave of bankruptcy. So far, the U.S. government has not bailed out the airlines to any great extent. They have simply combined and shrunk. So now you essentially have an oligopoly of 4 airlines that control about 80% of domestic traffic. And we have 3 joint ventures. They call them alliances, but they're really joint ventures. They control 2/3 to 3/4 of all the international flights.
David, since deregulation, there have been over 35 mergers of airlines in this country approved. I mean, That's the way, as Paul indicated, they deal with it. More and more concentration in fewer hands. Paul, before I forget, you just filed a petition on international air charges that are not being enforced by the FAA. Do you want to explain that? This is bread and butter.
Yes. We filed several petitions to the DOT and the FAA. The first one we filed in 2015 was to require the DOT to ensure that change fees for international flights were reasonable, because that's something that's in their statute, because most people don't realize it, but when they deregulated domestic fares, they did not deregulate international fares. However, for political and policy reasons, the DOT has refused in any way to regulate anything to do with international prices and fares. So now we have a situation where change fees have gone from essentially zero to about $800 to as much as $1,000, say, for European travel.
Just to change reservations?
Yes. So the way it works is it's really price gouging, and we've asked that they be capped at $100 unless the airline can show costs that are higher than that. The way it works is, say you're a family of 4 and you have to change your travel plans. Say someone has died or something emergency requires you to come back earlier. You could have to pay essentially the entire cost of your ticket. So you're forfeiting your ticket. Then you have to pay more for a new ticket. And then that seat is now empty. So the airline then resells those seats. So they, in effect, not only collect the change fee, but they collect triple. And those change fees and baggage fees are essentially our pure profit. And the airlines have been ramping those things up without any restriction whatsoever by the United States government. And it's got to the point where some foreign nations now are saying enough. You can't charge what you're charging or can't charge anything for 1 or 2 bags. And, the airlines don't have to abide by that, but that means they can't fly to that country. And guess what? All the airlines have acceded to those laws. But in the U.S., we have a law, but it's not enforced. So what happened in February, they finally got around to denying that petition, and we are now in federal court, in the D.C. Circuit Court, appealing that decision.
You see how in the pockets of the airlines the FAA is? This is a slam dunk petition. They have no reasonable response to not enforcing the law, to these incredibly gouging penalties that these airlines are imposing. And once again, Uncle Sam's the patsy compared to foreign governments.
Yeah. We have a couple of others. I don't know if you have time for them, but another thing that both the federal government and the airlines have been hiding from people is their delay compensation rights. In the United States, the only way you get delay compensation is through the bumping rule. However, for international flights, which is about 20% or so of all the flights coming from the United States, you have compensation rights under the Montreal Convention that go up to about $5,000. But no one knows about this because the airlines hide it. They won't disclose it. So we filed a petition to ask the DOT to both follow the treaty, which is U.S. law, and put on their website, as well as require the airlines to, in plain language, notify people of their delay compensation rights. And the airlines refused to do that, and the DOT has now refused also. So that one is also going up to the appeal court.
Why are these people being given salaries paid by the taxpayer? When Steve flies to India the next time and the plane is delayed, how much time does the plane have to be delayed before he collects up to $5,000 from the delaying airline?
The way it works under the Montreal Convention, it's a semi-no-fault system. You get whatever your out-of-pocket expenses are, and you can get lost time from work. You generally cannot get what's called hedonistic damages, although some courts will allow that. The airline, in order to get out of paying it, has to prove that they took all possible steps to not only avoid the delay, but to mitigate against it. And the delay can occur in the United States. So as long as any leg of your trip is outside the U.S., the Montreal Convention governs.
So how long can a delay occur before you start getting the right to compensate?
There's no set time, but generally it would have to be over 2 hours.
And the longer the delay, the more compensation you can get.
No, under the Montreal Convention, it's based on your actual damages. They're under EU rules, which affects all planes flying within those 28 countries or to and from them. They have a set schedule that can go up to about $800, and that is based on the time of the delay. It basically starts at about 3 or 4 hours.
Did you know this, Steve?
No, I had no idea.
Because your government won't enforce the law on your behalf.
Yeah.
It's another reason why you have to go on to flyersrights.org, because we have a whole section called Know Your Rights, and it goes into this in detail.
That's great.
There's one other aspect, if you indulge me. Boeing is the largest goods exporter from the United States. Each one of these planes retails for $100 million. If you multiply that by 5,000 orders, we're talking about $500 billion. It's a very big deal for the U.S. economy. There are about 2 million jobs that are directly or indirectly at stake here. And it is something that the reputation of the Boeing is at stake, the reputation of the FAA is at stake, but in a larger context, the whole reputation and the fact that the U.S. has been the dominant power in commercial aviation since the 1950s is really at stake. China is ready to come out with their own planes. So is Japan. So is Russia. So is even Brazil. And if Boeing doesn't recover from this, and the United States doesn't get their act in line, that whole industry, I think, will go bye-bye. It happened with Germany in the 1930s. It happened with the UK in the 1950s. They came out with the first jetliner called the Comet. Everyone thought it was a great plane. However, it had 3 fatal crashes in 1 year. They found the problem, they fixed it, but no one ever bought a Comet again, and no one ever bought a UK jetliner again.
So are
Heed
you
those warnings, Boeing.
Yes. Well, let me make sure I understood that. You're saying the impulse to save those jobs and the economy is on the side of full disclosure, not on the side of covering up.
The reputation for safety is in tatters. The public has very low to no tolerance for mass disasters. And you can argue that we fixed the problem, but you don't restore confidence, then those orders will be canceled. If you don't restore confidence, people will not get on the planes. We're hearing from people right and left, how do I avoid that bad plane? And they don't just look at the MAX, which has already been grounded. They just see the number 737, and they don't want to fly on that. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing pictures of 737s that are not the MAX, and they have like 1 passenger.
Wow. So like Ralph, as you say, better come clean or else.
That's right. They're facing a corporate crisis in Boeing, and they better not fight the investigations. Go back to the 737NG. Make sure the 737 MAX never flies again. It's been fatally tainted due to Boeing's criminal negligence. And once a brand is tainted by its own customers, it's very difficult for Boeing to ever recover, no matter how many full-page ads they put in assuring this and that. People no longer trust it.
What we've called for in the short term is for the president to meet with family members of the Ethiopian crash and to meet with passenger representatives and safety experts in the White House. He's talking to Boeing all the time. He's invited the airlines multiple times to the White House, but there's never been any meeting with those that are actually affected by these things.
And he meets with basketball, football, and baseball champions.
After Pan Am 103, we had a meeting in the White House with then President Bush. It was 103 days after the crash. And it was supposed to last 15 minutes. It lasted about an hour and a quarter. And after that meeting, that started a lot of balls in motion. And aviation security got a lot better, not as good as it should have been, and not followed through enough to be able to prevent 9/11, but it did a great deal. But without that meeting, the powers that be tend to prevail.
That's very important, Paul. We're going to push for that, too.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome back Richard Winger of Ballot Access News. Until then...
Stand up, you've been sitting ready.